Uh, I'd like to greet everyone to this talk between myself and my close friend Ken O'Neill. So we're going to speak a little bit about our individual background, particularly how we met and so on. But before we get started, I'd like to invite you for a short meditation from 30 seconds to 1 minute, please. So we can just sit quietly and clear our mind. Ready? And begin. Okay.
All right. So Stan and I are planning to do some fairly regular talks. What I listed on YouTube as far as subject matter, so people will be guided to it, is just generally metaphysics, energy work, and reality creation. So that any people doing search on YouTube on those subjects will probably see us pop up as well. So today's an introduction to what we're going to talk about on these subjects. We're going to give background information today, talk a little bit about how we met, various types of work that we've done on the subjects listed, and exercises and things that we've done with those and continue to do today. Actually, I met Stan on the SIU Edwardsville campus in 1973 through martial arts. I'd been doing some various arts there, and one day I was in the library. Actually, Stan, I took a look at my log, my martial art log, and it was November of 1973 when we met at SIU in the library. So I was upstairs and I heard this loud thumping sound. I couldn't tell what it was, and then it dawned on me it might be the big football dummy that's hanging in the stairwell in the library basement. I think somebody's kicking the heck out of that thing. And I looked over the stairwell, and there was Stan down there, and I ran down there, and we met, and that kind of kicked off our initial meeting. I'll let you add to that at this point.
Well, you know, at my age, because I am getting a little bit older, that memory is getting more faint. I do remember that bag. I remember the stairwell, and I remember the bag hanging there. And that was my little recluse area where I'd go and kind of hide out a little bit. But, you know, everything works out for a purpose. So, you know, at that time, I kind of needed somebody to hang out with, particularly to share, you know, the martial arts with. So, you know, things worked out pretty good when we met.
Yeah. It was, you know, I had started doing various martial arts a few years prior to that. I grew up in Collinsville, and then here I hear Stan down there, and I run down there, and I recognized that the type of kick he was doing was what I'd seen Bruce Lee do. And that kicked off a conversation whereby he connected with the original group here from St. Louis and was training with them. And then Stan started to train me. And that just led to an overall general friendship. We've done some information on that in other talks with Christoph Clugston. But I think the main thing related to that was another unique thing is Stan was on the finishing end of studying psych and philosophy, and I was more on the beginning end of that. He's a few years ahead of me there. And that just kind of, I think, was part of what facilitated our friendship. I mean, the martial art part was a real kind of a real connection or a real glue, because the other subjects fit in heavily. You know, the psych and philosophy fit into the martial art part, and you know, our friendship really kicked off there, and just been around for decades. We don't even want to probably mention how many. Well, I already gave out the number 1973. So basic arithmetic would tell you how long we go back. But I guess Stan and I are different in the sense that neither one of us were very, I guess, classical in our mentalities and very open. A lot of things that he was drawn to and got involved in that were not mainstream information were things that he shared with me, and that just stimulated my own personal drive to find information out there. I remember a title of a book a few years ago called Uncommon Wisdom. That might be a good place to frame it for now, for the start. But we were both drawn to things that not out there in the mainstream, and you know, we've gone various paths with information in those subjects, and you know, that's kind of the groundwork for starting to do these talks, and they'll get a little more. Oh, I don't know. I guess I'll use the word organized, but there'll always be a lot of spontaneity in them too. We'll pick specific topics at times, I'm sure, and go into those. But today, like I said, we're just trying to get some background and introduce ourselves. How about you, Stan? What are you thinking?
Well, you know, when I look back on how we met and, you know, how we developed, you know, our friendship, you know, it gives me a lot of gratitude, you know, because I feel like I was very lucky with the people that I've met, particularly with my teachers. You think growing up in Centerville, you know, right next between Cahokia, Belleville, Illinois, and East St. Louis, there wouldn't be a lot of, you know, avenues for really, you know, getting good education, you know, in any subject. You know, it was relatively poor area. But when I look back and reflect on my connection, because through when you mentioned Bruce Lee's kick, that was because in martial arts in East St. Louis, I was studying under an instructor, Mike Stalin, who I consider, you know, to this day to be one of the very top echelon in terms of martial arts instructors, particularly in his capability and knowledge. But also one of the senior students, Carlton James, was invited. Well, actually, he wrote a letter to Guru Dhananasana to be accepted at his school in California, and unfortunately, unbelievably, he was accepted. So he went from East St. Louis and then came back to where he went from East St. Louis to California, came back, and he updated us and he shared the material with us. So that established the link between us and the Bruce Lee method, even though I never studied at Mr. Inosanto's academy directly, but I still owe him a great deal of gratitude in terms of the knowledge that I, you know, obtained from him. But looking at the instructors I've had, you know, and I'll name a few just out of my gratitude, you know, Mike Sallin, Carlton James in East St. Louis, Guru Nate DeFencer in Chicago, Illinois, as I just mentioned, Guru Dan Inosanto in California, his link being a training partner with Sifu Bruce Lee, and other various instructors, you know, and plus Ken Yu, being a close friend of mine, you helped me grow. So I looked at this, you know, this life I've had to this point to be very fortuitous, very, very fortunate. So I know a lot was handed to me. So I have a great responsibility to disperse this knowledge, because I know it wasn't just for me, it's for me to, you know, gain more growth so I can share with other people. So I think that'd kind of be an underlying theme for the talks that we're having, you know, to be able to share what we've gained at this point in life with others, you know, that's willing, open to listen. But again, you know, I give a lot of gratitude to my teachers. Without them, you know, I wouldn't have the knowledge that I have now. So that's my spiel.
I know. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you there too. And a lot of people that may be drawn to listen to some of these could be a different crowd from what we've gotten on the martial art talks. And a lot of folks are probably wondering, well, what the heck does all that have to do with philosophy and psychology and getting interested in metaphysics and subjects related to energy work and such, you know? That's probably one of the things we need to try to establish, how that happens. Some people aren't familiar enough. I'll mention this much. Kind of classically or traditionally, a lot of martial arts were separated into so-called external styles and so-called internal styles. Internal being more dealing with developing inner senses and command of the energy that flows through your body, and using these for enhancing your health and helping you raise your consciousness to higher levels. More focused on that approach than a more overt combat-oriented approach, which were the so-called external styles. Now, that stuff's pretty arbitrary because they each contain elements of the other almost always, regardless of which side of that fence they would have claimed to be on. So in that regard, you know, being drawn to self-development and self-growth, internal aspects of martial arts are in particular directly connected to the idea of metaphysical studies and energy work in particular, because there are a lot of drills and exercises that we did in various arts to develop your abilities to sense energy within your own body and coming from other people, and in a larger spectrum, being able to walk into a place and sense possibly a violent event that's about to happen that hasn't even physically manifested yet. So that's just a small, kind of a short example of how martial arts are connected to metaphysics, and how, based on that general idea, it can be a medium for spiritual growth, you know. And that's I think sort of just a nice basic way to frame how those subjects are connected. Anything to add on that, Stan?
Yeah, you know, and Ken, one thing I think that's, you know, important to reflect on is that, you know, the media has a great deal of influence on everyone. So when you look at how martial arts are portrayed in film, you know, that being movies and television, it's really, you know, it's not getting a good representation at all, because they just focus on the combative aspect of it. And both of us know, as well as a lot of, you know, credible martial artists, that in martial arts entail a lot of internal training, a lot of mental and emotional training. Without that, the physical part of it, you know, wouldn't be balanced. It wouldn't actually, you know, be effective in the sense that you're developing a power that you can't really harness and control. So that's why it has to be, you know, buffered with also a very strong philosophical and mental disciplinary, you know, training. It has to be, you know, joined with that side by side so that you have a balance. And you don't see that in movies. You just don't see that represented. So that's the kind of image that people are looking at when they think of martial arts. So it's just fighting, it's just combative, you know, it's just beating someone else up, you know, and that's not it at all. You and I know it's really meant to beat up your ego, to defeat your
Great.
ego, to overcome fear, to gain confidence. Then the next step, where do you go from there? That's the key.
Yeah, you know, yeah. One thing we should point out though is pretty early on, there was one television show that really gave you a taste of this, and that was the old TV show called Kung Fu, which was originally designed for Bruce Lee to act in, and for various reasons that didn't happen, and David Carradine took the lead role. But oddly enough, an old student of mine, Jim Gerber, and I, on Friday nights, we are now systematically going episode by episode, watching that entire old series over and over again. And we just have immense appreciation for that, because that was the first time that probably the Western world was introduced to some of these ideas about what martial arts and spirituality and metaphysics, et cetera, could possibly have to do with each other, and pretty well depicted. And that series was very artfully filmed as well. You know, I kind of forgot about that until I'm back watching them again. But there were excellent lessons in there, excellent lessons, even along the lines of showing the levels of self-control, and how through martial training, which is, you know, at root, it's something very brutal combat, right? But in that training, you learn to develop a respect for other people as well. You start to realize, you know, the more cocky guys start to sometimes realize, ooh, somebody a lot smaller than me, and maybe female as well, can potentially control me physically. You know, it's a way to, like Stan said earlier, that's an example of how your ego can get broken down by the training, right? And that opens you up, and that makes you start to have more respect for people in general. Empathy and compassion come out of that. Hence, that's a great medium and a great kickoff for going deeper into metaphysical studies and studies on energy, etc.
Yeah, and another thing I like to point out too, and this really relates to popular culture, so a lot of people can relate to this. If you look at the movie Enter the Dragon that Bruce made, there was a 3-minute scene after the opening scene where he's teaching, his young apprentice, and his senior, that is Lee's senior, was giving him a philosophical talk about, the value of using force. He actually grabs Bruce's fist and said, "This is what caused the problem in the first place." So he said you should try to find the enemy within. You should try to reflect on the image. And Bruce uses that. He ties that scene in with how he defeats Han at the very end of the movie. It's a beautiful, connection. But what happened with the final cut of that movie, they cut out that 3-minute philosophical talk. So it didn't connect. And the reason that I read that they did say it's too philosophical for Western audiences. And I said, oh my God. But so it's difficult. I can see what Sifu was doing to blend entertainment with education, particularly when you look at the commercial aspect of filmmaking. Anything, that's the difficult thing to make work.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So hopefully people now have a pretty good idea how our meeting through that medium has connected to the other studies that are our main subject, and kind of kick that off. And it's you have to have ways to practice with these things, right? I mean, most people just read books on metaphysics. They read books on energy work. I'm purposely right now not even talking about the third tag that I put on there, which is reality creation, because that's another whole thing that's connected to the first two immensely. But I'll leave that one alone for right now. But the idea that you have a path, and one of the nice metaphors for our martial training has been that applying Bruce Lee's philosophy, and he got a lot of that from Jiddu Krishnamurti, influenced him dramatically, one of the philosophers he studied. And that's the idea that basically that life is a path, and it's very fluid, and there's a lot of spontaneity, and it's not overly systematic like we tend to try to learn things, that everything's cause and effect. A creates B and B creates C, and that life is different from that. And that's one of the things that you learn taking a martial path that expresses that, whereby you're trying to constantly reduce things and make things personal to you, things that work for you. And that's a great model for a metaphysical journey, because you have to experiment and you have to look at things. Everybody creates systems in martial arts as well as metaphysically, spiritually, and they tend to gravitate toward a sense of exclusivity in those things. And the downside of that is not one thing works for every person, because there's not two people that are completely alike. So you sort of have to create your own path. I think it happens to a lot of people inadvertently, even if they're not conscious of it. That's what starts to happen. They'll study things, they learn things, they develop, and then one thing can lead you to another thing. And over the course of decades, you find your own way.
Yeah, and piggybacking on what you just said, you start to develop an attitude also that, in terms of being exclusive, that you can't really function alone. Just like when I give gratitude to my instructors, if I didn't have a platform or basic knowledge or source of that knowledge, I wouldn't be able to function. And so it goes down from generation to generation. But I really do appreciate, and I understand further what the Sifu Bruce was speaking of, is that we can respect the past, but we shouldn't be bound by it. The structure should always adapt according to the needs. So I think what's happening now, we see with the change in technology, people are being thrown together whether or not they want to or not. So it's hard to really remain exclusive and separate now, because to keep your knowledge fresh, to keep it developing, you have to compare it with other things. and you got to operate in a larger, what I would call, in a larger environment where you're interacting with differences. You know, looking at you and I, for instance, okay, we shared a lot of things when we started, getting together with martial arts, but we also develop our individuality. You've gone a separate way, I've gone a separate way, but the differences seem to be more complementary as opposed to adverse. We don't compete in that way,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's the positive thing about it.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame things. Yeah, because we're talking about things here that we're so used to learning through the rote memory method, taking classes and things, and I'm talking about academics, of course, and then now all of a sudden you find yourself drawn into an area that is not as well defined in that regard. Although, however, there are so many schools and in ways to practice metaphysical exercises and paths of spirituality that are very systematic and have lots of exercises to help you move beyond just your linear everyday mode of functioning and thinking, to help bring you to the realization of the greater reality through which we exist. It's to me it's a childish thought that if you go back to some older, more basic kind of scientific views, that all this is just an accident and that our only purpose for really being here is simply to survive. I mean, if you would have told me that when I was 5, I would have thought it was stupid. I wouldn't have had a clue how to go beyond that, but just intuitively, if you're honest with yourself, you know that that's not right. You can just feel it. So when you feel that, or you have that sense, you're drawn to you're looking for answers, and you're looking for the bigger, well, why are we really here? And what's our purpose?
And for you and I, Ken, our platform was the martial arts, but it could be any particularly source of knowledge, any body of knowledge, any system, wherever you start at. It's just that wherever you are, you start to reflect on your life. Like you said, the purpose for living, what your objective is, what are your goals in terms of your spiritual development. So it really doesn't matter where you start. It's just that I think if you have a genuine, sincere desire to really develop and grow, because a lot of people mistake growing for adding knowledge on what you already have, but a great deal of it is like shedding misconceptions that you've had. Okay, and that's the challenging part. Okay, that's where we need each other, and I think the interaction is very critical for all of our growth. You can do things individually, that's fine, but collectively, it gives you a mirror feedback, so to speak, where you can kind of gauge where you're at, and you can also monitor your development, your progress.
Sure. Yeah, that's well said. And yeah, and Stan's right. I mean, it doesn't have to be through martial art. And for a lot of people, that would be a very odd way, not to mention an oftentimes physically damaging way to go, especially the way we came up through some of it. But yeah, there are many ways to do this. A lot of people dive right into various metaphysical kinds of practices and just go for it right there. I'm hesitant to use the word religious because usually the word religious suggests an extremely structured, very organized path followed by one particular type of group. And I think that can work for some folks. We've seen, definitely historically, I think we've seen some good evidence of that being the case. Yet at the same time, there's a trap in paths like that because you have an authority outside of yourself who's telling you what truth and reality are. And that can impede your growth because you're taking someone else's word for that. And the other really horrible thing that has come out of that through the paths of a lot of organized religions have been extreme abuses, using that figure or figures of authority, you could say, and them gaining your trust so much that people have been manipulated in very seriously damaging ways. But let's talk for a moment about some religions going to other countries and virtually destroying cultures and physically destroying people because they were heathens. I mean, that's the downside of trying to create some type of an organized system that creates its own mass conscious energetic ego that feels it has to project that on everyone else, that they should follow that particular way. That can be very dangerous. That's why I'm sort of staying away from that. I gravitated away from that very young, and stand in too for these reasons. Here again, not to say that there aren't people within organized religions that have gone a long way. Certainly there are. I just think, and I suspect Stan would agree with this, that it's probably easier to do it in other ways because you don't have to sift through what the authority figures are telling you is right and true, and you don't have to sift as much. You can go directly to it, I think, sometimes without going that direction. That being said, I guess we need to kind of talk about a little bit about, give an idea of some of the directions we'll head in with this as far as our own studies and our own paths. I'll let you kick that off, Stan.
Well, if I had to really advise somebody to take the path that I've taken, they would probably put me in an asylum. Because when I look back, I think I've led a very strange life, because, I've been sort of guided to certain things, just spontaneously. I didn't even have a chance to really research, on a cognitive level with consciousness. It was just more of an instinctive, energetic, magnetic pull. And I found myself there, and I said, well, okay, I don't know where I'm at, but it feels okay. And then I researched and I practiced, and I said, okay, so I think what's really, pertinent is for us who are on a spiritual or energetic or metaphysical path is to develop a strong core understanding that we're all one, irregardless. So, if someone is in, let's say, a set religion, if they research deeply into the core, the essence of that, then they will become liberated. This is a fascinating thing. But if they stay on the circumference, then they're more vulnerable to the propaganda within that belief system, and they could be easily manipulated. And this is one thing that I've noticed in people who are really strongly religious, they become spiritual. They reach that point. But I think that journey toward being from the religion to the spirituality could be somewhat of a shaky one. Okay, but once they reach that core, I would say in a cliche phrase, finding God within themselves, so to speak, then they become liberated because they have that source and they recognize it. But the path that I went, let's say for martial arts, it was funny because it was a Vietnamese gentleman in his mid-20s who introduced me to energy healing. Specifically, it was called Human and Universal Energy. And this is at a martial arts school. He came in and sat down. He didn't say anything. He didn't introduce himself. After class was over, I'm packing up in my car, putting my equipment in my trunk, and he looks at me and says, I have a gift for you. And I'm looking at this guy, complete stranger, right? What are you talking about? He said, I have a gift for you. He said, do you want to learn about healing? And I'm thinking, yeah, I've already wanted to learn about it, but I never had the opportunity or the patience to learn a lot of, methods. He said, okay, I'll teach you for 5 days straight, but if you miss a day, I'll stop teaching you. And that was all he said. And I looked at this guy and said, he's either absolute kook or he's a real McCoy, nothing in between. So to this day, as we're speaking, I don't know what in me made me trust this guy. Because this is initial meeting. But sure enough, he taught me for 5 days. And I think not too far after that, I introduced to you, Bill Vanderplum, Bill Thomas, and a lot of our close friends. And this is how we got started. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the personal feedback that I got from helping myself with my asthma and my father who had mild stroke and who's had arthritis in his mid to lower back, really severe arthritis. When I saw improvements in those areas, I just maintained it. And then there's a lot of things that happened from that point. That was 1992, early 1992, up until now. But I'll just kind of give a blank synopsis of where I'm going and where I've been. in other words.
Yeah, that's good. One of the things that you hit on that I really liked in that too was the idea that there wasn't a linear process involved in this. You were intuitively drawn to something, various somethings over many years. I would say, I guess, for both of us. And that's the part that they're not teaching us in school. You know, they don't talk about that. That's the hidden world, or what appears to be hidden. Probably the closest thing that people have to understanding that aspect of the bigger reality is the fact that they dream, and not realizing that when they're dreaming, they're tapping into that body of knowledge and that body of energy that is actually what creates everything else. But we're not taught that in school. So and from what I've seen in most organized religions, that's not taught in a way as directly as what I just said either, because a lot of times that message is filtered through layers and layers and eons and centuries of selective presentation of information to fit the agenda of the religion more than to openly help people tap into the objective consciousness that fuels and creates everything. So this is where other paths can lead you or help you develop your connection to the we'll use the word source or all that is. I'm hesitant to use the word God because as soon as I use the word God, most people get this image in their mind of some guy with flowing robes and he's sitting on a throne on top of a cloud or something, and he is separate and he controls, and it's not she or he and she, it's he, and a very masculine figure that's controlling everything like a puppet master. And to me, it's always been hypocritical saying we have free will, and yet everybody says, "Oh, you better not offend him, or you will suffer," and all that nonsense. That's controlling people through fear, and that was a tool that's obviously been contrived as a method of controlling people, and that's the kind of stuff that we have to get past because it's everywhere. I was not indoctrinated in a particular organized religion. I was given a choice at a very young age, and asked if I want to try a church because there was nothing else to try anyway. There was that one approach, and I'll never forget that I went to a church, and my criteria for picking that church were that I had two boys that I went to grade school with that were twins, and I liked them, and I just picked their church. I had no other way to figure out which one to try. And I went there, and I'll never forget that my first time in the church in Sunday school, they're doing the Jonah and the whale story. And like a typical 5 or 6 year old, I'm like, I hear something, and I'm like, the hand goes up, like I'm in grade school or something. I'm waving my hand, and I'm ignored, finally, because I wouldn't quit. The lady running the Sunday school class says, I think she asked me if I needed to go to the bathroom or something. It wasn't, do you have a question? And I said, that story sounds made up. That sounds like there was a cartoon at that time when we were kids called Beanie and Cecil. And I said, that sounds like a Beanie and Cecil cartoon. I was excommunicated pretty much right there. I was kicked out of Sunday school. I was sent home saying that, being told that, you're not supposed to question any of this. You're just supposed to listen, hear it, and believe it and follow it. So immediately that approach grated on me. It was deep in my nature already at that young age to not believe anything anybody tells me just because they told me, So I think this helps establish. There are some of us certain personality types, I guess. Let's not even use that. Let's just say some of us have, because we weren't taught not to have, some of us have had through most of our lives a stronger, I think, connection in a certain way to following these intuitive notions, like what Stan mentioned later. Something not super conscious, so something beyond that, drawing you in a particular direction. And if there's not someone telling you that's wrong constantly, you're more open to do that. And I think that's one of the most crucial things to realize, that people have to be careful with organized religions, because they can be so indoctrinated and so conditioned to not be open enough to question things.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, one thing that you brought out, maybe even unintentionally, is that there's an interesting dynamic between the two of us. And this may reflect a little bit on the culture, but not a lot. Because within the culture of black and white, that never came up in our relationship. And the reason why I think it never came up, because it did not matter. When we met each other, it was one guy meeting another guy who shared a common interest. We
Yeah.
got to know each other on a personal level. So we bypassed all that. So I think the interesting dynamic, I think, that we'll have during these talks is that I'm more comfortable using the term God because I'm using a terminology that can relate to a person's background. But in how you define God, what more so how you define what God is not, rather, is perfect. So even when I use the word God, it has that definition behind it. It's just energy. And if we were not part of God, we wouldn't exist. If we weren't part of that source, it's in us. But it's just the terminology so that you can relate to different people. And I think that would be a good dynamic in how we express our, opinions or our insights, during these talks. But it's really important. I think, our relationship really has a very good, not only physical meaning in real life, but also symbolic as well. When you get to understand somebody and know them on a personal level, you bypass all this nonsense. And it's the same thing, I think, when you're on the spiritual path. If you really need to go to the core, you bypass a lot of these traps. I really think you just avoid them.
Yeah, that's well said, and that's an important one too, because you could apply the same thing to the people people of the opposite sex. The same kind of dynamic, if two people come together in such a way that's just natural, and they're drawn through a common interest, there doesn't have to be this big thing because one's a guy and one's a gal. That doesn't have to interfere either. And yeah, racially, that's interesting because yeah, I guess you got to think back as far back as we met. That was around the time some pretty explosive stuff going on in the country as far as the races go. And here again, this might also speak to how you're raised. I was never raised to think about that having any real meaning at all. That there was no talk about this race is better than that race. I was in public schools and races were mixed from the time I was a little kid, so that never really was a big issue for me, and it wasn't. I don't think it was for you either. But still, people being influenced by the conditioning of other people around them, somehow we didn't. We just here again we didn't buy into it. That's just the nature, I think, of the kind of people we've always been. Is we don't buy into stuff just because everybody else is doing it, and that's an important element. It really is.
Yeah. I have a close friend. We haven't spoken in years, though. She's from Santiago, Chile, and I met her through the studies of universal energy. She was studying other modalities as well as, universal energy, the method that we shared. And she said the guidance that was coming to her from other teachers was telling her that you have to separate from the collective consciousness. In other words, to find your own role, your own mission, your own purpose in life. Because the collective consciousness is sort of like a mass informational field. It really just kind of indoctrinates you through how you want to fit in with the system, so to speak. So they're telling her from a spiritual plane, say, look, you got to disconnect from that to find yourself, to find your own freedom, your own way. And that was pretty enlightening, when she shared that.
That's huge. That's huge because one of the books that I'm rereading right now, it's one of the Jane Roberts books, where she channeled Seth. I'll talk more. Stan and I will both talk more about that as time goes on. But this is phenomenal information. The particular book is The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events, and Stan just tapped on it right there with your you're surrounded and influenced by, because there's a constant interchange of consciousness and thoughts between not only all humans, but humans and plants and animals on a level way beyond what you would ever really think about or believe until you really study and look into it. And there are various exercises you can do to experience these things. But yeah, you're surrounded by this. This is why it's really dangerous to buy into mass beliefs. Case in point, look at all the mega hospitals that exist on the planet, because of the mass belief that's now shared by more than not that's how you get healthy and stay healthy, and that some arbitrary outside force creates all these illnesses and diseases in the world, and you have to go to, here again, to an outside authority to be cured. And that's a really dangerous one right there. And I tapped into that a long time ago, early on in my studies, and decided I'm not going to buy into it. And the initial result of that is I went 32 years without ever having a physical. And that's when I had a physical at year 32 was in 2004, and I literally got chewed out by the MD who was doing the physical, that I'm virtually insane, that I could possibly have believed that I could remain healthy for all those years without intervention of an outside. I mean, the guy said he called me crazy. And it became very clear that he went on a mission to show me that there was going to be something wrong with me. I mean, EKG, tests for rectal cancer, all kinds of crazy stuff. And the only thing that character could come up with was, he said, you might have an inguinal hernia in your groin. I said, no, I don't. And then he got really angry, and he said, how can you know that? And I said, I know my body. That's why I never had to come here for 32 years. I said, the only reason I'm here today is I have to have a physical for a life insurance policy for my business partner, or you wouldn't have seen me today either. And I said, I know what you're referring to that you think is a hernia. It's a muscle strain, because I was doing abdominal crunches with extremely heavy weight at the time, and I could feel it. I pulled the groin muscle. You know, I mean, this guy was actually angry that I wasn't buying into the mass belief system of which he was a major part, and he couldn't divorce himself from his own beliefs to possibly acknowledge it. So his end comment was, well, you're just lucky. And I said, yeah, I knew you were going to say
that. Okay. For all the listeners, we're not advocating to not have physical exams, but I think the gist of the point is that, you know, we give up a lot of our power. We give up a lot of our capacity, you know. And Ken touched on something important. You should always be able to feel what's going on with your own self, if not only just on a physical level, but even emotionally and mentally. But, you know, we have all these outside agencies, you know, someone to take care of the physical body, somebody to tell you about your problems, someone to help console you, okay, emotionally. And we're going through an awareness, though. So there's a positive side. So a great segment of population now, they're becoming aware of this. So they're all fighting this trend. But I think the general populace is still trapped into this because it's so alluring, you know, it's so comfortable, you know. As Ken mentioned, you go every 6 months for your checkup and so forth. And we know one very disturbing fact is that in the doctor's training, they only have one course related to nutrition. And a lot of physicians now, they complain that they don't know how to prevent illness. They only know how to treat. And so if you look at that equation, that balance, there's something wrong with that picture.
Yeah. Now, another important thing that I feel I need to throw in here too is I would actually go the opposite direction you would think I would go. I would tell most people, you better go out and get your physicals, only because most people still believe in that model. So if you believe in that model, you're setting yourself up to be a victim within it. So if that's the case, you better not ignore it, because you could get really sick and literally die, because you're so tied into that belief system that you are setting the stage energetically to have to rely on it. So you better get your physicals. To do what I did, you have to be very clear, and you have to have spent a lot of time working on your beliefs before you would do something is that doctor would tell you I was insane for doing it. You better know what you're doing if you're going to take that approach. I would suggest most people actually follow that, because I can hear in their language and see in their actions that they believe in it. And if you believe it, you're going to create your reality around those beliefs. So I would say get your physicals.
Yeah, because you create and actually reinforce your dependency on it.
Yes. Yes.
And that's what a lot of people say we give up our power. You see it in so many different areas in society, particularly even in politics, where you can vote for a guy, but then you expect him to take care of everything, and then when you find something shady happening, you complain about, oh my God, why would he do that? Well, if you put people into power and they don't have the right sense of value or honor, and plus if they're tempted to do something wrong, that's human nature. Chances are, yeah, they're going to do something that's not going to be ethical. So you got to have a system of checks and balances, right? So, but another point I'd like to add to that too is that when you have professionals being trained, this is again just epitomizes human nature. They can develop what I call tunnel vision. So our version of health is what we see in the United States, where you have villages in Russia. I think they live in the northern part. They average up to 80, 90 years old, and they can still function. And they don't have physical exams, and their diet is such that it preserves their health. Plus, they have minimum stress. So you have all these other factors to look at. But again, with the tunnel vision, they can only work within one system of thought.
Yeah, and the good thing is now you can see this idea creeping in. You see now. I mean, think about when we were probably even in our 20s. If somebody would have told us then that there'd be all these 80-year-olds running marathons and doing weight training and all the stuff that a lot of 70 and 80-year-olds do now, we just said you're crazy. First of all, most of them aren't going to live long enough to do that anyhow. So the paradigm is shifting. People's mentalities are changing, and folks are starting to realize that they're capable of going beyond these old models. See, but it takes a while for those things to be accepted and for the status quo belief systems to become mass enough that enough people begin to all believe that it's true. And then once that happens, you start seeing those old ideas go away, those old beliefs go away, and the new beliefs take over. And now you're seeing more. I mean, go to any gym now. I have one of my students just turned 65, and so all of a sudden he can go to any gym practically in St. Louis for free, right? So he's going through the gyms, and he comes to class last week, and he says, "You know what the most interesting thing about people in those gyms were?" And I said, "Yeah, I bet I know." And he goes, "What?" I said, "They were mostly seniors." And he goes, "Yeah." And he says, "Who would have thought of this, 20 years ago, that these gyms would be overridingly packed with older people?" And I said, "Yep, because we were told before, might as well give it up. You're going to die. You might as well just go sit in your chair and watch the Beverly Hillbillies over and over again until you go."
Hey, don't criticize. I like this show.
Yeah, me too.
But that's an important point you brought up in terms of the paradigm shift, because we know metaphysically and also spiritually, those two are very intertwined. We create our own reality. So whatever thought, belief system you're working with, you're going to create that entire environment that you have to work in. So you got to break through that particular belief system. But we see it, like you said, we see the trend right now. I call it sort of like a mass awakening. Just like you have mass programs, so now we're experiencing a mass awakening. People are waking up, saying, "Hey, I don't have to be bound by this. I can still be virile. I can be healthy. 70, 80 years of age. So that really opens up a whole nother door.
Sure. That's why it's important for things like what we're doing right here between Google and YouTube. And, now all of a sudden, everybody on the planet can virtually talk to everybody else. And they say, let's still live in one of these antiquated countries that doesn't want you to see what other people are doing around the world. But, and this is part of why it's happening. And I think it's accelerating is people have access to each other, I've met a lot of people doing these very types of talks with Christoph Clubston, on the subject of martial arts that, I would have never known these people existed. But, all of a sudden, you get out there, and now the world's being it's being shrunken through this kind of medium. Here, here's an example of where the technology helps to help the paradigm shift in the direction that's better for all. And I'm noticing something too. It's funny how the negative brings out the positive. All this insane, bizarre stuff going on in the political world, particularly in the U.S. right now. And yet, I see how also I think it's getting a lot of folks to be much more verbal and active in various ways about opposing that, and not just sitting back and taking this stuff that's being thrown at them. I think potentially people talking like we're talking now and sharing with other people may be the single best catalyst to actually create we'll call it the new Big Bang, in the shift of consciousness to a higher level that's more equitable for all beings. And I'm not just saying human beings. That's why I said all beings, period. The earth itself, plants, water, all the stuff that people just have taken for granted as being things to use. That water is out there in those oceans is as much your blood as your blood is. And the air, the O2 coming out of those trees is your O2, and your CO2 is shared with the tree. It's all connected. We even know this through science, and people forget about this. They don't think about this on a daily basis. And it's important to remember all this stuff because it gives you a different attitude about, do I want to even throw this one little piece of paper that's annoying me in my hand on the street? Or do I want to put this in a proper trash receptacle just to keep the street cleaner for other people? I mean, even on a micro level like that, it's you shift how you relate to everything. You become more respectful of everything, period. And I think this is important.
And along that line, important challenges for us is how we communicate with each other. I'm hearing an echo on my end. Is there one on your end?
No.
Okay. I hope it's not affecting the broadcast.
Try turning down your volume on your just a little. I just turned mine down.
Okay, I'm only at 52. Okay, it's at 40 now, so it should be okay.
Yeah, I just turned mine down to how's it now? Can you tell the difference?
Yeah. Yeah, there's no echo.
We might have both, or one of us, or both of us may have hit it up a little high, get that loop going. Yeah.
I think what I was speaking of, I think one of the main challenges that I see today is how we communicate with one another. I think once we get to the core of who we are energetically, and like you mentioned, how everything is interrelated, interconnected, right? We can understand our differences. So instead of butting heads that we have a tendency to do, we'll tend to share our viewpoints and see if we can find a common bond. Because the whole objective in terms of even communicating is for us to gain more knowledge, more information that's going to affect how we act or how we create in a speak. Okay. So our whole purpose for interaction is the learning process. So when we're communicating, we're engaging in a learning process. So in that aspect, we should be very mindful to be respectful of the other person because they're helping you grow. So even if there's a difference of opinion, there's a purpose for that difference of opinion because we have various backgrounds. No one is going to think the same thing, the exact same thing on a particular topic. If it did, I don't know what kind of world this would be. This would be, first of all, totally boring. It would be unproductive for one thing if everybody was the same. So there's a difference, there's a purpose for our differences. So I think once we become really conscious of that at a core level, then we'll tend to listen more. And that's the problem that I see now. We don't really listen to one another. We try to talk over or we try to defeat the other person. And, that's totally counterproductive in how, we should evolve.
Yeah, that's important to say too, because look at the weirdness. I mean, my goodness, I don't know, at least 12 years now or so, you've seen this in the political arena here where extreme division, you would have thought by now, historically, people would have learned how to work through it. I mean, all these congressmen and senators have to you know, they have to learn how to come together, even though there's two main parties that have generally very different basic beliefs on how things should be. You know, over many decades, people were always able to work together. I think generally a lot better than anything we see now. And yet at the same time, there's that extreme example of divisiveness. But then there's still this whole other dramatic giant body of people out there, probably bigger worldwide than ever, that are along the lines of what we're talking about, who have a much more expansive consciousness and understanding of things. I think part of what's going on is that group of people, myself included, tend to not directly participate in that political process because a lot of us see it as so ridiculously antiquated. We're just sitting back waiting for it to collapse the rest of the way, and out of that, something new to grow because it's not working. You know, and I think part of what's happened is the world has changed so much that these old models of two political parties and the kind of nonsense that creates, this group versus that group, it creates competition rather than cooperation, and that mentality is suggested just by the idea of parties in the first place. You know, so you know, there's a lot of us out there, I think, that are just waiting for that to go the rest of the way and collapsing, because it seems to be headed there anyway, for the new paradigm to develop and grow. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes the best way to not feed into something is to not participate or give it any energy whatsoever. So the more you sit there and want to argue politically, one side or the other, the more you're just feeding energy to the whole mess. It's better to back off and not feed it any energy at all. Something doesn't have energy, it dies. That's the model of the universe. So whether it's an insect or a human being, if there's no energy, it dies.
You know, it's really profound, even in the spiritual, energetic level, while we were born, while we came into the world at this particular time. Because, like you said, there's a mass group of other people that are awakening too. But the way I look at it is that whether you're in the system, and let's just use politics as an example, whether you're in the system, you participate, or whether you don't, it's really probably based on your destiny. Because perhaps some people are destined to work within it to make changes. But their road, their path may be a lot more challenging than ours. But we may need to be participant and active in another way, and maybe in another field. But it will all fit together because the predominant awakening, the insight that we're getting is that we're all one.
Yeah.
We've come from one source, we all one source, and we're going to evolve together as well, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
This division and separateness has been just sort of like conditioned, programmed into us.
Sure.
It's a belief system, like you said, it's not working now. And particularly a lot of younger people are definitely seeing this. This has to change.
Funny you should mention that. I'm sorry, were you done? The most interesting thing that popped up on YouTube this week was a news story, a little news story. I don't remember where it was, but it was at I believe it was a grade school. Now this is out there, right? The kids are playing soccer, but guess what? It's not one team competing against another team. It was an exercise in cooperation. And I need to go back and find that and look at that closer, because I thought, oh man, if this idea can even come into sports somehow, talk about a shift in consciousness. You know, the idea for once of somebody not trying to defeat the other. You know, that's a major deal. You know, it just shows how these ideas are filtering through on all different levels simultaneously, that we all have more to gain competing with we all have more to gain cooperating with each other and working together than we do competing against each other. That's an old model that's created more mayhem and murder than we need to even talk about. It's so obvious, you know.
You know, on that line of thought, I think what prompted me to remember something, that when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, he wrote this really extensive text, right? You know, The Origin of Species. But what we gain from that is that the strong will survive, the weak will perish. Where there was another writer that actually researched that book. He says, no, Darwin's main theme from that book, from that research, was that cooperation was the most important ingredient for survival. Cooperation, not competition, not the strongest will survive. So it's really funny how things can get twisted and turned around.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So hopefully what we're accomplishing with these talks is stimulating people to look at things in a new way, or just gaining more perspective on what they're already doing, even if they're already kind of in line with what we're talking about here. The bottom underlying, I think, message we're trying to get across is open yourself up and try to grow. Get out of the old notion of it's me versus the world and it's us versus them and all that nonsense, and let's get past that.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get people to give us feedback on these talks, and I think we'll be guided like we've always been in life. Like you mentioned before, things happen spontaneously. Even if you have an outline, you have a definite plan, it's always altered according to what the needs are. And you and I have been very, I think, fortunate in that aspect, that we've been guided a great deal of our life, and where we're at right now, we appreciate, we feel, that we're fortunate where we're at right now. So I think the same thing will be happening with these talks. As we develop, we'll go into different topics and share a lot of information to help ourselves and others.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I think, ooh, that was an odd, something going on there. Can you hear that? I don't know what that was, but yeah, and along those lines, we'll have some talks too where we'll open it up. We'll invite other people, and they'll be able to jump on the screen with us and comment and all too. We'll have to organize that a little bit, but I guess that's it from my end. Stan, anything else you want to finish with?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone who took the time to listen to us old geezers talk about our background and so forth.
Yeah, we've got that covered now, so we'll just go right into it. I'm guessing we'll probably try to do this once a month. Do you think? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Yeah, that'll work.
That's what's on my. And if we get overwhelming response over time, maybe we'll increase that. But for now, that's the plan. So yeah, thanks to you folks who are going to listen to this after it goes up on YouTube, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Take care, Ken.